You used to feel everything, every shift in the room, every awkward pause, every subtle change in someone's tone. You walked into a conversation already sensing how it would end. You left interactions emotionally drained, even when nothing bad happened. And now, something feels different. You don't rush to fix people anymore. You don't absorb every emotional wave. You don't carry other people's moods home with you. So naturally, someone eventually says it. You've changed. And for a second, you wonder, did I lose my empathy? Did I become colder? Did I stop caring? Here's the truth most people never hear. You didn't lose your empathy. You healed it. Carl Jung once said, "Where your fear is, there is your task." For years, your fear wasn't conflict. It wasn't loneliness. It wasn't even rejection. Your real fear was learning how to stop emotionally merging with everyone around you. Because when you're deeply sensitive, you don't just understand emotions, you carry them. You feel responsible for the atmosphere. You feel guilty for setting limits. You feel uneasy when you choose yourself. But healing doesn't make you less caring. It makes you more grounded. And that's where things start to look different from the outside. You're calmer now, quieter, less reactive. Not because you stopped feeling, but because you stopped bleeding emotionally for every situation. And that's what people mistake for distance. So if you're not an empath anymore, what exactly did you become? That's where this story really begins. Before you became calmer, before you learned how to step back, there was a version of you that lived on emotional high alert, not because you wanted to, because you didn't know how to turn it off. And that version, it was exhausted. The old empath mode, always on, always drained. You didn't just notice emotions, you monitored them. Every pull shift, every hesitation, every moment someone went quiet. Your mind instantly started working. What did I do? Did I say something wrong? Are they okay? You weren't trying to control situations. You were trying to keep emotional balance in the room. And that came at a cost. You absorbed stress that wasn't yours. You carried tension that didn't belong to you. You felt responsible for how other people felt, even when they never asked you to be. Carl Jung once said, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate." Back then, your emotional sensitivity was running your life. You didn't choose when to care. You cared automatically. You stayed in conversations longer than you wanted. You over-explained your intentions. You softened your words to avoid discomfort, not because you were weak, because you were hauled to protect emotional harmony. But protecting harmony doesn't mean protecting yourself. You went home mentally tired, even after simple interactions. You replayed moments in your head, searching for emotional clues. You felt uneasy when someone was distant, even if it had nothing to do with you. You weren't too emotional. You were over-attuned. Your empathy wasn't balanced. It was overflowing. And when empathy has no boundaries, it turns into emotional labor you never signed up for. Jung wrote, "The burden of the self is always carried alone." But in the old empath mode, you carried everyone else, too. That's why healing didn't make you colder. It made you lighter. Because the goal was never to stop caring. The goal was to stop carrying what was never yours to hold. Then something subtle happened. Not loud, not dramatic. You didn't wake up as a new person. You just stopped feeling like an emotional emergency responder for everyone else's life. And for the first time, your empathy stopped running the show. The shift. When empathy stops controlling you, you didn't become numb. You became aware. You started noticing how often you were reacting instead of choosing. How often your emotions moved before your mind did. How often other people's moods decided your energy for the day. And slowly, you began to pause. You stopped rushing to fill every silence. You stopped fixing feelings that weren't yours to manage. You stopped treating emotional tension like a personal failure. Carl Jung once said, "I am not what happened to me. I am what I choose to become." That choice changed everything. You began responding instead of absorbing, observing instead of merging, listening without carrying the weight of every word. Not because you stopped caring, but because you finally cared about your own emotional limits. You realized something important. Understanding someone doesn't mean sacrificing yourself for them. So you stopped over-explaining. You stopped shrinking your needs. You stopped feeling guilty for needing space. And surprisingly, the world didn't fall apart. People handled their own emotions. Conversations still happened. Life kept moving. But this time, you weren't exhausted by it. Jung wrote, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are." And who you truly were wasn't a constant emotional responder. You were someone with depth, not dependency. Your empathy became quieter, more focused, more intentional. You didn't lose sensitivity. You gained stability. Now, when emotions show up, you don't panic. You don't personalize. You don't overanalyze. You simply notice. And that's the real shift. Empathy stops being a reflex and becomes a choice. You still understand people. You just don't let their feelings steer your inner world. That's not emotional distance. That's emotional direction. And once you experience it, you never want to go back to the old way. Once empathy stops controlling you, something surprising happens. You don't lose your depth. You don't lose your awareness. You don't lose your ability to understand people. You simply gain something better. Control. What a healed empath actually becomes. A healed empath doesn't disappear. They evolve. You still notice subtle shifts. You still read between the lines. You still understand what people don't always say out loud. But now, you decide what to do with that information. You don't rush in to fix. You don't feel obligated to absorb. You don't mistake awareness for responsibility. Carl Jung once said, "The self is not only the center, but also the whole circumference, which embraces both conscious and unconscious." In other words, you're not just reactive anymore. You're whole. Your empathy becomes precise instead of overwhelming. You listen without losing yourself. You care without collapsing into the situation. You can be present without being pulled. Supportive without being drained. Understanding without being overextended. You no longer confuse kindness with self-erasure. A healed empath knows when to lean in and when to step back. You stop chasing emotional approval. You stop explaining your boundaries. You stop proving your sensitivity. Because you finally trust it. You realize something powerful. Not every emotion needs your energy. Not every problem needs your presence. Not every person needs access to your inner world. Jung wrote, "One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious." You faced the part of you that feared being seen as distant, and you chose stability over overgiving. Now your empathy has direction. It's calm, steady, intentional. You're no longer emotionally everywhere. You're grounded exactly where you are. You still care. You just care without losing yourself, and that's the version of empathy that actually lasts. Healing doesn't show up in big, dramatic moments. It shows up in the small, everyday situations where the old version of you would have reacted automatically. And now, you don't. You notice the change in simple conversations. Someone sounds distant. The old you would have immediately assumed it was your fault. Replayed the last interaction, searched for emotional clues. Now, you pause. You don't personalize it. You let people have their own inner worlds. You walk into a room and sense tension. Before, your body would tighten. Your mind would go into problem-solving mode. Now you just notice it. You stay grounded. You don't rush to fix the atmosphere. In disagreements, you don't over-explain. You don't soften every word to avoid discomfort. You say what you mean, calmly. And if someone doesn't understand you, you don't panic. You don't chase clarity. You let silence do its work. Carl Jung once said, "Everything that irritates us about others can lead us to an understanding of ourselves." You stopped reacting to emotional pressure and started learning from it instead. You also notice it in your energy levels. You don't leave conversations feeling drained. You don't carry other people's stress home with you. Your mind feels quieter. Your body feels lighter. Your reactions feel slower, in a good way. Even your boundaries feel different. You don't announce them. You don't justify them. You simply live them. You say no without guilt. You take space without apology. You choose calm over chaos. And here's the part most people miss. You didn't become distant. You became stable. You're still present, still attentive, still aware. But now, your empathy works with you, not against you. You're no longer pulled into every emotional moment. You choose which ones deserve your energy. And that quiet confidence, that steady presence, that calm response, that's the healed version of you in action. Not loud, not dramatic, just powerful in the ways that actually matter. When you stop reacting the way you used to, the world doesn't quietly adjust. It notices. And not everyone understands what they're seeing. Why people think you've changed, people were used to the old version of you. The one who always listened, always adjusted, always made emotional space for everyone else. You were the calm presence, the understanding one, the person who never made things uncomfortable. So when you stopped over-giving, it felt like a shift, even if it was actually growth. Now you don't rush to explain yourself. You don't soften every truth. You don't absorb every emotional ripple in the room. And to people who benefited from your constant availability, that feels like distance. Carl Jung once said, "The meeting of two personalities is like the contact of two chemical substances. If there is any reaction, both are transformed." Your reactions changed, so the dynamic changed. You're quieter, but more grounded, less reactive, but more intentional. Still caring, but no longer overextended. And some people confuse that with coldness. They say, "You're different now. You don't care like you used to. You're not as emotional." What they really mean is, you no longer operate the way they expect. You stopped managing other people's feelings. You stopped prioritizing emotional comfort over honesty. You stopped carrying what wasn't yours. And when someone is used to your emotional availability, your boundaries feel like a loss. But Jung reminded us, loneliness does not come from having no people around. but from being unable to communicate the things that seem important to oneself. You didn't grow distant, you grew clearer. You now express what matters without over-explaining. You step back without disappearing. You stay present without losing yourself. That balance feels unfamiliar to people who knew the old version of you. So they label it, they question it, they misunderstand it. But here's the truth. You didn't change into someone colder. You changed into someone steadier. And steadiness looks different to those who are used to your emotional flexibility. You didn't lose your empathy. You gave it direction. And not everyone knows how to read that yet. Once you stop worrying about how others interpret your growth, you finally get to experience what healing actually gives you. Not distance, not coldness, but something far more powerful. The real power of the healed empath. The real power isn't in feeling everything. It's in choosing what deserves your energy. You no longer absorb emotional pressure like a sponge. You don't mirror every mood in the room. You don't confuse awareness with obligation. Now your presence feels different, calmer, steadier, grounded. Carl Jung once said, "I am not what happened to me. I am what I choose to become." And what you chose was clarity over chaos. You can listen without losing yourself. You can support without self-sacrificing. You can care without collapsing under emotional weight. That's not emotional distance. That's emotional strength. You don't rush to respond anymore. You pause. You consider. You act intentionally. Your empathy becomes focused instead of scattered. It moves with purpose, not pressure. You're no longer pulled into every emotional moment. You choose which ones deserve your attention. And here's the quiet confidence that comes with it. You don't need to prove how caring you are. You don't need to explain your boundaries. You don't need emotional approval to feel secure. Jung wrote, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are." And who you truly are is someone who understands emotions without being ruled by them. Your strength now comes from balance, from awareness, from restraint. You can be present without being overwhelmed, engaged without being drained, supportive without losing yourself. That's the real transformation, not louder emotions, not deeper sensitivity, but steadier control over your inner world. And once you experience that level of emotional independence, you realize something important. Empathy isn't about feeling more. It's about feeling smarter. You don't carry the world anymore. You walk through it with clarity. And that's the kind of power that doesn't need to announce itself. It just shows up, calm, steady, and unshakable. There's one final shift that quietly changes everything. It doesn't look dramatic. It doesn't sound powerful. But once it happens, you realize how much energy you used to waste. The moment you stop explaining yourself. You used to explain everything. Your tone, your intentions, your boundaries, your need for space. You wanted to be understood. You wanted to avoid being misread. You wanted to make sure no one felt uncomfortable. So you over-clarified, over-justified, over-explained. But healing changes that. Now you say what you mean, and stop there. You don't chase agreement. You don't manage reactions. You don't rewrite your words to protect other people's comfort. Carl Jung once said, "The pendulum of the mind oscillates between sense and nonsense, not between right and wrong." You stopped trying to control how everything sounds. You focused on what actually feels right. And that's when your energy shifted. You no longer feel tense after speaking your truth. You no longer replay conversations in your head. You no longer wonder how you came across. You said what you needed to say. That's enough. You also stop explaining your boundaries. You don't give long reasons. You don't negotiate your limits. You simply live them. And here's the strange part. The more calmly you hold your ground, the less resistance you meet. Not because people suddenly agree with you, but because your certainty makes people for fewer arguments. Jung wrote, "Knowing your own darkness is the best method for dealing with the darkness of other people." You understand now that clarity doesn't need decoration. You don't need to prove your growth. You don't need to defend your calm. You don't need permission to protect your peace. You show up steady. You speak simply. You move forward without emotional noise. And that quiet confidence, that's not distance. That's self-trust. There's another quiet change that most people don't notice at first. But once it happens, you realize how much of your identity was built around one role. When you stop needing to be the emotional one. For a long time, you were known for one thing. You were the understanding one, the patient one, the emotionally available one. People came to you to talk things out, to vent, to feel heard, and you took pride in that. Not because you needed attention, but because being emotionally present felt like who you were. But healing shifts that identity. Now you don't feel the need to perform empathy. You don't feel responsible for carrying every conversation. You don't feel like soreness means you're failing. Carl Jung once said, "The shoe that fits one person pinches another." You realized that not everyone needs the same version of you. Sometimes being present means listening quietly. Sometimes it means saying very little. Sometimes it means stepping back completely. And that's okay. You no longer measure your worth by how much emotional labor you provide. You don't feel uncomfortable when you're not the supportive one. You don't feel guilty for letting others handle their own emotions. You don't feel pressure to always be emotionally available. Because you finally understand something important. Your value isn't in how much you absorb. It's in how grounded you remain. Jung wrote, "People will do anything, no matter how absurd, to avoid facing their own souls." You stopped rescuing people from their own emotional work. You stopped making yourself responsible for their growth. And in doing so, you gave yourself something rare. Emotional independence. You still care. You still understand. You just don't center your identity around being everyone's emotional anchor. You're no longer the empath. You're simply you, calm, clear, and self-directed. One of the most subtle yet powerful shifts you feel as a healed empath isn't in what you say or do. It's in what you stop doing. The freedom in not fixing everyone. You used to feel responsible for other people's emotions. Every frustration, every disappointment, every small upset. It was like carrying a backpack full of invisible weight. If someone was sad, you tried to cheer them up. If someone was anxious, you tried to calm them. If someone was overwhelmed, you tried to solve it, even when they didn't ask for help. Carl Jung once said, "The greatest tragedy of the family is the unlived lives of the parents." And in a way, the same applies to emotional lives. The greatest tragedy of empathy is the unlived life of the empath. But now, you experience freedom. You notice emotions, but you don't feel the need to fix them. You can witness someone's pain without making it yours. You can offer support without taking responsibility for the outcome. That's the real power. You're no longer drained by other people's struggles. You no longer replay scenarios in your mind, to make things right. You no longer overthink reactions to protect the emotional balance of others. You can engage and then step back. You can care and then let go. You can be present without being pulled into chaos. Jung wrote, "Every form of addiction is bad, no matter whether the narcotic be alcohol, morphine, or idealism." You see now that overfixing was a kind of emotional addiction. It felt necessary, but it stole your energy. Healing gives you permission to stop, to observe without absorbing, to care without carrying. And that permission? It's liberating. It feels strange at first. People might think you've become distant, but you're not distant. You're finally unbound, finally steady, finally free. And once you experience that freedom, you'll never go back to being the emotional one again.